From the opening tip-off to the final buzzer of the big dance, this is where the madness lives. The roar of the student section, we hear it. The bracket-busting upsets, we predict them. The legends in the making, we've got the stats on lock. Whether you're a die-hard alum or a casual fan of the chaos, you're officially on the clock. This is the pulse of the court. This is the home of the hoop. And this is Hardwood Gameday. And now, the man who lives and breathes the game, here's your host, Trevor Williams.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's rendition of Hardwood Gameday. I'm your host, Trevor Williams, giving you the best, latest, and greatest in the news of March Madness. We are on March Madness Eve, ladies and gentlemen, and things just keep getting more interesting in the men's bracket. From Miami of Ohio, now 31-1. Do they have what it takes to make it into the tournament? We'll find out tomorrow, ladies and gentlemen. But losing early in the MAC tournament, does that hurt their chances of pulling off the unthinkable Cinderella run? Is their seeding going to be favorable of getting them across that goal line and be able to have a fantastic dance? It's a lot of things that we're going to have to decide on how everything unfolds. I know a lot of the bigger conferences were playing some of their semifinals last night. Quarterfinals leading into their semifinals today. I mean, there's a lot of things that were happening in the men's bracket last night overall from enthusiastic performances. But the thing that we got to look at from last night's games is Arizona. They are, I would say, a questionable team that's going to get seated really high, but could have a possible early upset. Let's look into that game between Iowa State and Arizona as a quick recap. But before we get into that recap, ladies and gentlemen, make sure you go and follow ETB, ladies and gentlemen, on all of our social media platforms. It will help us out a lot, get us closer to our watch hours of 4,000 so we can get monetization, so we can get some new cool bells and whistles on our channels, and also have more capabilities of production and stuff like that. So make sure you keep watching all of our content, and it gets us one step closer to the magic of making this more of a special network for you and ourselves here on Empty the Bench, ladies and gentlemen. But also go follow my socials as well so you can see the latest and greatest of the activities that I got going on. I mean, the last 2 weeks, I know I was out in San Diego, visit Callan, went to San Diego FC. But, ladies and gentlemen, we got to start looking at March Madness because we are here. We are on March Madness Eve, and it's going to be a fantastic performance all the way around. But let's dive into it. Let's do the recap of Iowa State and Arizona, ladies and gentlemen. The final score of that game was 82-80. Arizona sneaks past this one, ladies and gentlemen. Do they deserve to sneak past it? I really don't think so. They got lucky on top of that. They shot better from the field, which kind of did go into their favor. But Iowa State was capitalizing left and right. They didn't go to the free throws now, ladies and gentlemen. But when you lose by 2, let's take a look at the stats where you could say, well, if they made all their shots here, they walk out with a W. So, for example, free throws. I should just make a shirt that says, make your own free throws, ladies and gentlemen. Make your own free throws. So, Iowa State, ladies and gentlemen, they shot 4 for 8 from the free throw lines. And now you ask me, if they made those free throws, they win this game by 2. However, Arizona did the same thing. They went to the free throw line 16 times and only made 10. So if you break that down a little bit more on the free throw line, now granted, as the game was getting close, obviously there's more fouls going to send Arizona to the line. But if you take away probably some of those late game fouls that puts them to the line, I think you have something else that's a little bit different on the free throw margin percentage. But now if you look at the rebounds between the two schools, 34 for Iowa State and 33 for Arizona, the boards are relatively clean for rebound purposes, relatively easy. But percentage led, majority of this game was by Iowa State. I think Iowa State has that capability to do some upsets throughout the entire tournament. Like they get a seeded, like maybe a 5th seed in the mix of it all, wants to create the chaos of that low seed and just kind of run through. But then, ladies and gentlemen, you got to take a look at the field goal percentage. I have been preaching it the entire Hardwood Gameday season. The field goal percentage dictates a lot in these games. So if you look at Iowa State's field goal percentage in last night's game, they were 31 and 36 from the field. You got to shoot a little bit better. I know 47% can win you most games, but when your opposing opponent went 55% from the field, that is tough to beat, ladies and gentlemen. But then you look at the score, it's like Arizona only wins by 2, but shooting 55% from the field, that's one thing. But, ladies and gentlemen, the field goal percentage. Arizona shot 32 for 58 compared to Iowa State's 31 to 66. So Iowa State just had way too many shots being missed right now, ladies and gentlemen. Now, is it the right time to get around that, like lose right now in your semifinals and get that bad shooting percentage up? Absolutely. This doesn't penalize you until you get to the tournament. It may hurt you in your seating, but ladies and gentlemen, this is where you want to get out the growing pains, the last bit of growing pains that you have. But for Arizona, they're heating up at the right time, shooting well from the field and less shots. But you can't be playing these close games like this. Yes, it helps you to bounce back, but let's take a look at the margins of this game. In the first half, ladies and gentlemen, Iowa State was 43 to 37 winning that game. Now, the margin's not that high on top of that, a margin by 6. But then you look to the second half, it's the complete opposite. Iowa State grows cold. They get 37 in the second half, and Arizona gets 45. So, like, as you can see, the tide starts to shift in the second half. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. A little bit of runny nose with all the cold weather swinging through the Midwest region as of late. But it's one of those things, when you look at the Big 12 standings alone, you got Houston. Kansas had a disaster last night. We'll dive into that right after this. But then I would say the top 4 outside of what happened to Kansas, now you're looking at the top 3, could have a possible deep Elite 8 run, depending how things shake out. Now, I can see Arizona slipping up, but most likely Arizona could be, I want to say, a high 2 seed, maybe a 3, depending on how the selection goes for them. But you win your tournament, you kind of start favoring as a 1 or a 2 seed, depending how things shake out for you. But it's one of those things we have to keep a close eye on. But now, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at the recap to Kansas and Houston. What a game that turned into a disaster. On top of that, like, Kansas just had a meltdown. The score of that game was 69 Houston, nice, to Kansas, which had 47. Like, what happened? Let's dive into that game, ladies and gentlemen, so we can give you the latest and greatest. So in the first half, ladies and gentlemen, going into that game, Houston was up 33 to 25. Not too pretty, a very low-scoring game from the start. But then you run into the second half. Again, nothing too flashy on Houston's side. 36 to 22 for Kansas. I mean, Kansas, what was happening, my dudes, my guys? Like, that's unacceptable on top of that, There's ways to turn it around, but You can't be shooting like that going to March Madness. Like I was saying to Iowa State, get the bad shooting performance out now so you can build that momentum up in the tournament. However, you kind of need your conference tournament to help you out later into this run that you need to do. Now, if you lose a heartbreaking fashion and shoot great from the field, that's one thing. And then it just comes down to, free throws and turnovers, the easiest way to break that down. But when you have something like this, ladies and gentlemen, the field goal percentage for Kansas, ladies and gentlemen, let me just tell you how bad it was. 25% from the field. They shot 57 shots, 57, and only made 14 from the field. Let that sink in. We haven't seen a big school, a basketball school like Kansas. Let's make that clear, because Kansas is a basketball school. Shoot like this in quite some time, especially in your conference tournament. Houston, on the other hand, looked good, but not best from the field. 42%, 22 for 53. Not too bad, but you got to get that up closer to 50. You got to get to that market, that milestone. If you don't, you most likely might lose how March Madness goes. But we all know there's always that Cinderella team where there's that kid that always shoots threes and they always make it. And he shoots 4 of them in a row and at the 12-point swing. And we're watching all of our brackets go down in flames because of that one kid from that one small school. Nobody's heard of this kid, and he's probably a finance student or an accountant. That's how it is, ladies and gentlemen, in the world of March Madness. But, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at the other stats. The 3-point percentage for Houston looks pretty good, 56%, ladies and gentlemen, with a 10-18 record. Not a record, but from the 3-point line. However, Kansas, on the other hand, ladies and gentlemen, was 7-23. Not too pretty, I would say. And then you have the free throw percentage. Again, the more free throws you make and have a higher percentage, the more likely you close out these games. Kansas, ladies and gentlemen, I think you need to start packing your bags. You might have an early round exit based on how you shot last night. But they shot 12 for 18, which is not bad, 67%. Now, Houston looks pretty good with 79%, which was 15 and 19. Turnovers were both 8 for both schools. And you look at rebounds, ladies and gentlemen, 37, 42. What does that mean? And across that board along that line. But majority of the time, that was more towards Houston's effort, and that on top of that, ladies and gentlemen. But the question is, how far does Kansas become a 7th seed? Are they a 6th seed? Like, where does Kansas sit in March Madness for making the Big 12 tournament? I mean, you could have them as a 4. I don't think they're a 4 seed. They're definitely a 5th seed more than anything else. And with a possible upset to a 12 seed, I could see that happening. I could see Kansas going down in flames in the first round, depending on who their matchup is. We won't know until tomorrow, once all the brackets come out later that evening. I won't be on those shows because I got work. My whole work schedule changed, ladies and gentlemen. But like I said, we got to figure out what is going on, ladies and gentlemen. The problem in the Big 12. That's what we got to look down forward to. But that kind of includes the Big 12 recap right now, ladies and gentlemen. Now let's take a look at that Big 10 action as we make our adjustments to, I know, a later game that ended up happening as we have things start to adjust themselves to UCLA knocking off Michigan State. Let's dive into that one a little bit. As I accidentally click, because ESPN has those ads on the pages. We gotta love ads, ladies and gentlemen. All righty. With that, let's now dive into that section. I know you're asking why haven't we covered a lot of the women's stuff right now. A lot of their brackets basically pretty much done and ironed out. They played a lot of their conference tournaments anyway, or anyhow, I should say. So we got focus on the men's side because that's where all their conference tournament is. That's how we have last week, where we focused on a lot of the women's games and there wasn't much men's games going on as they were making the transition. But ladies and gentlemen, UCLA does the unthinkable. And now they knock off Michigan State in the quarterfinals, now headed off to the semifinals, ladies and gentlemen. What a time to be alive, to be a UCLA fan, UCLA Bruins fan. Knocking off Michigan State. I would say UCLA was consistent. 44 points in the first half, 44 points in the second half. That's what you like to see, a consistent performance for UCLA. We like that 100%, ladies and gentlemen, on top of that. But like I said, the field goal percentage shows, your shot selection shows. I mean, free throw percentage, we like going in the free throw percentage, ladies and gentlemen, because that's what wins and breaks games. UCLA, 79%, Michigan State, 77%. You can't complain from that percentage. But UCLA from the free throw line was 15 for 19, and Michigan State was 17 for 22. Now, a little bit of a runny nose still. But, ladies and gentlemen, you have to look at the game as a complete percentage hold from this game. At some point in the second half, in the first half, UCLA started to make the transition, and the field goal percentage from Michigan State showed. Because in the first half, they were down by 11. Michigan State only had 33. And then the second half, they roared back, but it was a little too late. In the second half, they went 51 for Michigan State. 51 points in the second half. That is an impressive swing from going 33. But UCLA kept it consistent. They were there from start to finish. They knew how to perform. They knew how to close out. And that's what it ended up showing. But from the field goal percentage, ladies and gentlemen, you have UCLA shooting 30 for 54 with the 56%. And Michigan State, ladies and gentlemen, was 45. Again, you need closer to 50. If you're over 50, you're going to win. Now, if they're both over 50, now that just comes down, like I said, free throws and turnovers. Who gets the steals, the blocks, the key momentum swingers, and then making sure you're all in the right run at the right time to close out the game. That's the best way to break down basketball in its most simplest forms altogether, ladies and gentlemen. Most simplest forms. But the threes, they were about the same. 48% from the three-point line. UCLA was 13 for 27. And Michigan State, ladies and gentlemen, was 11 for 23. Wow. Look, it's just one of those things, like they just shot well and it kind of worked out. But, ladies and gentlemen, now UCLA goes on to the semifinals in the Big Ten, trying to win it, trying to have a spring of life to get into the tournament, as their women's team has done well this season. The men is trying to make a statement, say, hey, we too can ball, and we can turn it around and make it work on top of that. I see that my slide didn't change. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. But that's what we got going on. Michigan State falls off. Does that aggravate them to make a deep run where they make it to the Elite Eight? Or do we see a Sweet 16 exit for Michigan State? We got to see how the brackets shake out. We'll go a little bit into bracketology after we wrap up our last recap game from yesterday that happened later in that evening. But I don't think we need much more, evaluation, I should say. Now, if we take a quick look at the final one, we're going to dive into Purdue and Nebraska. But I kind of want to look at the Illinois upset more than the Purdue and Nebraska game, because that is just going to motivate Illinois. So let's dive into that one over the Purdue-Nebraska recap. So let's just dive into that one. Now, when you look at Wisconsin and Illinois, it's a 91-88 final score. Now you're asking me, what happened? Where did it go wrong? So first half, ladies and gentlemen, breaking it down for you, giving you the best thing possible for it. You have Wisconsin coming in 24-9, looking for that momentum. And then you have, Illinois 24-8, looking for that turnaround in this season, the spunk, the pizzazz. But in the first half, it was 30-36. And then in the second half, Wisconsin roars back to get those 6 points to make it 48-42. And then the overtime shows up when it mattered the most. Wisconsin gets 13-10 over Illinois. But from the field, ladies and gentlemen, here's the stat line where Illinois shot better from the field, but lost. It's very rare where that happens, ladies and gentlemen. But the shot selection that we saw, 35 for 70 and 50% in that aspect. But Wisconsin was 48 and 66. You know where they lost and why they lost? Preach it in the comments, ladies and gentlemen. The free throws. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the free throws. The margin of free throw percentage is what hurt Illinois in this game. When you look at the free throw margin, Wisconsin was 83% from the free throw line. 83%. With a 25 and 30 overall from the free throw line. Illinois, on the other hand, they were 9 for 15. 9 for 15, ladies and gentlemen. 9 for 15. When you look at that, that is 60%. That is, in college, sometimes C's get degrees and you might get that 60%, or D's get degrees in that instance, ladies and gentlemen. And you kind of get that class as a pass-fail. But in the terms of free throws, you can't be shooting 60%. You gotta be aiming for 80 or above, or a high 70. That's where it goes from there. But outside of the 3 points, they shot god awful from the 3-point line, both schools. Like Wisconsin shot 10 for 41 from the 3-point line, and Illinois shot 9 for 31. They were just horrendous from that, ladies and gentlemen. Horrendous, I tell you. They just can't shoot it. And majority of the time, Illinois led this game. They were the favorite. They shot well, but they just didn't make the free throws when it mattered the most, ladies and gentlemen, just when it mattered the most. But now let's start diving in to the NCAA men's bracketology. Now, ladies and gentlemen, with the men's bracketology, it gives us a high overview of where teams kind of sit in their ranking thus far. So, as of when the bracket was last updated in bracketology at 7:12 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time now, because we have crossed daylight savings, we have to figure out who's the top seed, last team in, and first team out. So overall top seed most likely will be Duke, and I can see, I'll say, another one seed in a different side of the bracket. I like that. But last team in, Texas from the SEC, sure. That checks itself out. And then Oklahoma being left out, sure. But we'll see how this ends up shaking itself out. So right now, if we look at the East in Washington, D.C., in Greenville, we have a possible number 1 Duke versus UMBC as a 16. Then Ohio State as a possible 8th seed, ladies and gentlemen. An 8th seed. Yes, they played Michigan tough, but as an Ohio State fan, I don't know if I want to be a part of this tournament. You got Villanova, who's also a basketball school. And the last time I went to that March Madness, Ohio State lost. So I feel like, I'll take the 8th seed if that happens, but do I really want to deal with that? Probably not. But then you look down as you go further into the Philadelphia in the East region. You have Vanderbilt and Akron. Akron as a 12. could be an upset to Vanderbilt, but Vanderbilt has been proving themselves wisely in the SEC right now. So that's an 8-5 matchup where it could go either way depending on how it spins itself out, for sure, ladies and gentlemen. But that's a 12-5 matchup where Akron might have a slight edge, but if Vanderbilt gets off to a hot start, it might be an early round exit for Akron. But Purdue versus Northern Iowa, I like Purdue to win it, but in years past, they always have a meltdown, and at the worst possible time, it could be to Northern Iowa, but I don't think that's going to be the case this time. I think they're going to walk out with the victory. Now, then you have, in the St. Louis part of the East region, you have Louisville versus Missouri. I like Louisville in this matchup, or VCU, depending how that 11 seed shakes out. Then you have Illinois versus Tennessee State as a 14. I like Illinois to take care of business and win that side. I don't think Tennessee State gets that victory, but again, bracketology isn't really, confirmed yet, I would say. It's projected, but not confirmed. But then that kind of rounds it out for the most part in the East. The Midwest and Chicago, you have Michigan as a 1, as I mentioned. Lehigh versus Florida A&M. Could we see Lehigh get in and upset Michigan? They've done it before, and a long time ago in the early 2010s, where they knocked off Duke as a 15 seed. Can they do the unthinkable and upset the Maize and Blue in Buffalo, New York? I mean, it's a little bit easy to travel for people from the Lehigh Valley to make their way up to Buffalo, but it's a tall task to take down a blue blood as Michigan. But then you have an 8 and 9 seed of Georgia versus St. Louis on top of that. And then you have in the Tampa part of the Midwest, you have Arkansas versus McNeese. McNeese is an upset team I like as a 12. Like that is a good 12 seed to pick as a flip to upset Arkansas. I really, really like that one 100%. Then you have Kansas versus Hofstra. Hopefully I'm saying that right. If not, please, correct me as best you all can in the comment section. But don't murder my slander of schools as I get through some of them. I like Kansas to take it out, but could we see a 13-4 upset? Possibly here. But then we go down to a little bit more in the Midwest region, Wisconsin versus Miami of Ohio. They have Miami of Ohio as an 11 in the bracketology. I kind of like that, but losing early round on the MAC, I think they might slip a spot or two. They might become a 12 seed. They might become a 13 seed. We don't know. But then you have Alabama versus Troy. I like Alabama to take care of business in that aspect. Then you have things to round things out. You have Miami versus Texas A&M. Another mix-up matchup. I could see Texas A&M pulling that upset. And then you kind of round it out with UConn and Queens. I think UConn take care of business, and they don't have much problem there. The Houston area, you got Florida from the SEC right now leading versus a possible 16 matchup between Louisiana Tech and Idaho. Then you have UCLA, TCU. I like UCLA in that matchup. St. John's versus High Point. Give me St. John's if that happens to be the case in the bracketology. Texas Tech versus North Dakota State. Texas Tech, but again, a possible 13 seed upset. And then you start rolling down to South Florida versus North Carolina, possibly as a 6 versus 11. Then Nebraska versus Wright State. I like Nebraska to win that one out. Then you have St. Mary's versus NC State. I like St. Mary's in that one as a 10-7. Then you have Houston versus Long Island. I think Houston takes care of business there. Then you kind of start rounding things out for the most part, ladies and gentlemen, in that scenario where you have Arizona and Howard. I like Arizona, even though they struggled a little bit. Utah State versus Iowa. I like Iowa over Utah State, but again, a great matchup. Tennessee versus Yale is a 5-12 matchup. I mean, Yale could do the upset, but I don't think so. I think this year, if the bracketology holds true, I think we might only have like a one of the 12s pull up the upset, but it's March Madness. Anything can happen. But out of the teams I've listed, there's really only one 12 seed where I feel like they can get the job done to pull up the upset. And I don't think Yale could do it. Virginia versus Utah Valley, not really feeling it. Then you have SMU versus Texas versus a possible BYU 11 seed matchup. Gonzaga, again, as a 3 seed, they've been consistent, but they haven't really convinced me to get to the Final Four in quite some time. Always an Elite 8 squad. Don't count them out on that front. But it's very difficult to pick them as a possible winner. Then you have Clemson and UCF to start rounding things out. Then you have Michigan State versus Furman to round things out at the end. But, yep, the first 4 out, ladies and gentlemen, will be Oklahoma, most likely, Auburn, New Mexico, and San Diego State. And then the last 4 out, the next 4 out after that is Indiana, Stanford, Cincinnati, and Seton Hall. Last 4 in, you have Missouri, VCU, SMU, and Texas. And then the last 4 byes that have like the last teams to skip the first 4 rounds. You have NC State, Santa Clara, UCF, and Miami of Ohio for the men's bracketology, ladies and gentlemen. So that's what we got going on that front. But let's dive in towards the women's bracketology a little bit to see how they are shaking out before we go into today's games on the men's side. So in the women's bracketology now, ladies and gentlemen, you have your schools that we know that are most likely going to be on top for the women's side, like UConn, South Carolina, and UCLA. And there's probably another school that I'm forgetting that should be up there as well. But if we look at the women's side of the bracket, you have UConn as a 1 versus FDU versus Howard as a 2 possible 16 seed. NC State versus Iowa State, the battles of the states. We love that as an 8-9 matchup in Region 1 for the women's bracket. Again, we're looking at bracketology, how if the brackets were released today, what they could possibly look like, but it's not guaranteed until we have the show. Then you have Ole Miss as a 5 seed versus a 12 seed matchup with Virginia versus Arizona State. Then you have Maryland versus Miami of Ohio. So Maryland's a 4, and Miami of Ohio is a possible 13 seed. Then you have Texas Tech as a 6 seed versus Fairfield as an 11 seed. Michigan is a possible 3 seed versus Idaho as a 14 seed. And then you kind of round things out with Illinois as a 7 seed versus Clemson. Vanderbilt as a 2 seed versus Western Illinois as a 15 seed. Now, Region 2, out in Sacramento, you got UCLA versus SF Austin. Then you go into Tennessee as a 8-9 matchup against Syracuse, which will make an interesting 8-9 matchup where I can see Tennessee upsetting UCLA, but UCLA for the women's, ladies and gentlemen, just has been dominant across the board. I think it's a lot of the 1 seeds are most likely going to get there, depending on how you look at it. I would like to see a UConn UCLA final because that just seems really good on paper. Or depending on how the bracket sets itself up, you could get a Final Four with like UConn and South Carolina in the mix-up versus Texas and UCLA. Again, great match that we end up getting. But Kentucky as a 5th seed versus James Madison as a 12. West Virginia as a 4 seed versus 13 seed Green Bay. Baylor as a possible 6 seed, Rhode Island as a possible 11 seed, 3 seed of Louisville versus a 14 seed of Charleston. Then you go down to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, with number 7 Washington that could be facing number 10 Colorado versus number 2 UCLA versus number 15 Holy Cross. In the 4th region, ladies and gentlemen, you got South Carolina versus High Point, and then it goes into an 8-9 match versus Oklahoma State versus USC. Then you go to Minneapolis with Minnesota as a 4 seed versus Louisiana Tech as a possible 13. Gonzaga as a 12 for the women versus number 5 North Carolina. Then you have Alabama as a possible 6 seed versus Nebraska as a number 11 versus another number 11 as Richmond as they battle out for seeding. Versus then you have a 3 seed of TCU versus a 14 seed of UC San Diego, ladies and gentlemen. And then you kind of round things out for the most part with a number 7 Oregon versus number 10 South Dakota State. Then you go into Iowa as a possible 2 seed versus CA Baptist as a 15 seed. Then to round things out, ladies and gentlemen, we are diving into the 3rd region. You have Texas, number 1, as a possibility, versus Alabama State versus Samford as they battle out for 16. Villanova versus a Virginia Tech as an 8-9 matchup. Looks pretty good on paper, if you ask me. Michigan State versus Murray State, a 5 matchup. I like Michigan State, but you could have a possible upset in the 12 in that picture. Oklahoma versus Colorado State, who's a possible 13. I like Oklahoma to take care of business there. Notre Dame as a 6 seed versus Rice as an 11 seed. Then you got Ohio State as a possible 3 seed versus Vermont as a possible 14 seed. You start rounding things out around the corner, around the bend. Then you have a 7 seed as Georgia versus Princeton, who's a possible 10 seed. Duke as a 2 seed versus Jacksonville as a 15 seed. But I like the Columbus side because if I get those matchups, Ohio State takes on Vermont and wins, and then they face Notre Dame. That's all in Columbus. Like, that's right in my backyard. I mean, stadium is about a 20-ish minute walk, more like 30 minutes, with all the traffic. But that's like walking to the shoe, which is not a bad walk for where I'm at. But depending on the weather, and the weather's not nice. I mean, if it's during the day, I could see myself walking there if I give myself enough time, enough leeway, which will be a nice little walk for myself. But we'll see how that shakes itself out as the bracket unfolds for the women's side. But if it happens, we get a Columbus matchup, I am definitely going to try to make my way to that game and take pictures because I did it last year. I went to the women's game. Got, like I said, for the round of 32, I think I paid $39 to sit in like section 114 AA. Like, that's how close I was to the court. Hopefully I can find something a little bit similar around that aspect and just see when they end up playing. If it happens on a Thursday and Friday, I'm in business. I'm excited because that's when I have a little bit of off in my work schedule. If not, it's not the end of the world. But we'll find out as things, like I said, progress forward. Now let's start looking at today's games, ladies and gentlemen. One moment as I sneeze. All righty. Looking at the schedule. Right now, games are quite underway right now with Cornell and Yale going at it on ESPNU. And then UMBC versus Vermont is also underway as well. Now, we're curious about the Ivy League to see where Yale stands up. Let's just take a quick look at that live game right now. But right now, towards the end of the first half for that game, ladies and gentlemen, Cornell was down by 7, 40, 47. Take a look at what's going on. Cornell's shooting well from the field. They're just not making their shots right now. Again, but they haven't been forced to the free throw line, but the threes are kind of starting to show a little bit. Where Cornell shot 63% from the field, and Yale has shot 58% from the field. Yale has 20 for 36, and Cornell is 17 for 27 right now. So, I mean, free throws are just not there right now. It's very still early in the game, so not a lot of shooting fouls at the moment, but we'll see how that all unfolds right now. One moment. But now let's dive in to some of the games that we got to take a look at. We got Michigan versus Wisconsin. And then you got Vanderbilt versus Florida to take a look at as well. And then you also have a possible St. John's versus UConn, which is another great match that we'll dive into as well. And then Virginia versus Duke to round things out in the evening, ladies and gentlemen. All right, let's dive into it. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen. First things first, let's dive into the men's side of things. Wisconsin versus Michigan. Michigan has a 82% chance of victory today, ladies and gentlemen. What a matchup that we have here. Versus Wisconsin, 17% chance to win. It's very difficult to see how this edges out. But if you look at the last, couple games, going to overtime with Illinois and Michigan winning relatively convincingly by 14, I like Michigan's odds to take care of business today at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 10 a.m. Pacific Time on CBS, ladies and gentlemen. It's a thing that is one that we're going to have to keep a close eye on. On top of that, I mean, that's really like their only common opponent within the last 5 games if we're trying to, compare apples to apples to. But from like the field, Michigan kind of averages over 50%. And Wisconsin's at 45%. So that field goal percentage is definitely going to come loud and true in this matchup. If Wisconsin has a way to keep a consistent field goal percentage and Michigan has an off night, off afternoon, it's very possible for Wisconsin to pull this one out. But just the stats alone, the points against Wisconsin really doesn't have a good defense. They're giving up 76 points on average compared to Michigan's 69. Nice. But ladies and gentlemen, I think Michigan takes care of business and walks out with a nice little dub in that aspect, if you ask me. You can catch today's game at noon, at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on CBS, or 10 a.m. Pacific Time on CBS. Now we're going to the SEC semifinals, ladies and gentlemen, with Vanderbilt versus Florida. Vanderbilt has a 30% chance to win compared to Florida's 69.3%. It's still nice. We're going to say that. We're going to need to make an ETB shirt that says 69. Nice. And like question mark. That's all we need on it. I think it works. It also could work on a coffee mug as well. We might have to work with the marketing team to figure that one out, ladies and gentlemen. But we might need branding to work on that 100%, ladies and gentlemen. But, I mean, relatively, their defenses are not relatively that good. I mean, Vanderbilt did lose to Kentucky 91-77, and Florida beat Kentucky twice, convincing both times. First time they did it was 84-77, and then they did it again 71-63. So looking at the common opponents there, ladies and gentlemen, I just like Florida to take care of business and get the dub and advance to the SEC finals. Points against, they really give up a lot of points now. Florida gives up about 71 points a game compared to Vanderbilt's 74.9 points per game, almost 75. It's one of those things. Where did they go wrong? That's all I can say. Where did they go wrong? But, ladies and gentlemen, as we round things out, we look at that alone. You can catch Vanderbilt, Florida today at 1 on ESPN at 1 p.m. Eastern Time as well. Other men's games, ladies and gentlemen, that we break into is UConn versus St. John's, a Big East final that will be electric for St. John's. They're at a 52.6% chance to win that game, ladies and gentlemen, compared to UConn's 47.4% chance to win this game. In the Big East, St. John's, the Red Storm, they're 18-2 in the Big East, and UConn, ladies and gentlemen, was 17-3. What a matchup that we got. Two good teams in the Big East. Teams that will, when they get good in March Madness, they are good in March Madness. These are teams that will cause upsets to other seeds depending how things shake out for them in this matchup. But UConn has a better defense. They only give up about 65 points per game compared to St. John's, about 70.5 points per game, almost 71 if we're just going to round up, play with clean, nice numbers. But the block parties goes to UConn with 5.4 compared to St. John's 4.8. Steals go to St. John's with almost 8 steals a game compared to UConn's 9 steals a game. And then points on average, St. John's averages about 82 compared to UConn's 78, ladies and gentlemen. But if you look at some common opponents they have, you know, they played Georgetown, which we could look at the game. When they played Georgetown, UConn won 67-51. When St. John's played, it was 72-69. But then when you got Seton Hall comparison, I mean, the margin's kind of starting to show that St. John's slightly better when they played Seton Hall. Seton Hall, when St. John's played the first time around, it was 72-65. And then the second time, it was 78-68. When UConn played, it was 71-67. However, when UConn played St. John's, ladies and gentlemen, UConn won that matchup was 72-40. Let's dive into that game. What happened? Where did the meltdown happen for St. John's? As we look at that matchup, the meltdown. How do you only score 40 points in men's college basketball? What happened? But St. John's shot 20% that night, back in the night in February. And UConn, ladies and gentlemen, shot 47. Like I said, closer to 50 means a possible win. With St. John's, ladies and gentlemen, on top of that, I don't know where they went and won. They shot 11 for 56, and UConn was 28 for 59. From the threes, kind of relatively similar, a little bit close in percentage wise. St. John's was 5 for 20, and UConn was 7 for 25 in that aspect, ladies and gentlemen. But St. John's was 76 from the free throw line, which was 13 for 17, and UConn was 9 for 11 with an 82% from the free throw line. Turnovers 8, UConn was 5, rebounds 37 and 41 for UConn. But UConn kind of dominate majority of this game. But you could see in the first half, it was 26 to 41. And then UConn kind of let off the gas a little bit, which was 14 to 31. So that's where that is. Hopefully, St. John's can turn it around and round things out as well. And then, ladies and gentlemen, in the ACC, most likely final that we got, T. Rowe Price as the sponsor for that game. Duke is trying to claim their number 1 seed yet again. Only 2 losses of the year. 17-1 in the ACC. Virginia, on the other hand, ladies and gentlemen, was 29-4 with a 15-3 ACC record, ladies and gentlemen. But, ladies and gentlemen, we're looking at a possible game that might be quite interesting. When the last time Duke and Virginia played, it was a runaway. Duke won 77-51. But as you look at common opponents, Duke beat NC State 93-64. When Virginia did it, it was 81-74. Outside of that, that was like their last common opponents. But let's take a look at the last time they played each other back on February 28th, 2026. In that matchup, ladies and gentlemen, we have Virginia faltering. They did 26 for 40 to 41 was the first half score. And then the second half, Duke kind of let up a little bit, but still winning by a significant margin. Virginia got 25 in the second half compared to Duke's 36. But from the field, ladies and gentlemen, again, Virginia shot bad from the field, 29% from the field, which was 16 for 55, compared to Duke's 26 for 53, ladies and gentlemen, which is kind of what hurt them. The field goal percentage was just rough altogether. But then you have the three-point line. Duke shot 50%, which was 12 for 24, and Virginia was 7 for 35. Those are the probably biggest things that kind of hurt Virginia across the board. But hey, the free throws look good for both squads. Virginia was 12 for 13. Duke was 13 for 14. Turnovers was 9 for Virginia. Duke had 8. Rebounds, 29 for Virginia and 37 for Duke in that scenario. But that kind of rounds out that game, ladies and gentlemen. Like, I think Duke wins the ACC. I don't think they get stunned in this matchup against Virginia based on what happened in the past. Definitely things we got to look forward to see how things grow and develop. But that's kind of around that March Madness Eve, kicking things off, building that momentum. But think about your brackets now, ladies and gentlemen. What is needed to get the job done? What magic is needed to require the victory to get your school to the finish line, to hoist the national championship, to cut down the nets, to save that snippet in your locker room or in your trophy case, to be forever etched in college basketball lore, saying that your team is a national champion. The banner is being hoisted in the rafters. You think about it. That will be a time to be alive. But, ladies and gentlemen, as we start to conclude today's program on how things look for all that we have going on in the world of college basketball with 5 minutes left. I know Hardwood Gameday has probably most likely 3 weekends left as we have March Madness start to go through, and with the tournament kind of rounding out in the beginning of April. After, I want to say Easter, but I could be wrong. We got 3 more weekends. Excuse me. But we have 3 more weekends left, I would say, for the most part. I got another sneeze coming. But it's been an honor of having Hardwood Gameday. That's what we have. I know as we close out our college, we have a little bit of a slower time, slower season. So I'll probably might be doing other ETB shows, or I would say other projects that we got going on the network. So I know we're thinking about doing more of the entertainment side, looking at video games as a possibility, maybe get into a little bit of a sports franchise with people on ETB and kind of make our sports league in our off seasons for a lot of, football and stuff like that. But we could also start looking at the NBA and building up that aspect of that as well, ladies and gentlemen. So a lot of different things that we're going to be looking at in the coming months of ETB as we round things out. But also for other things outside of that, today is National Pie Day, 3.14. So make sure you get your local pizza pies or your baked goods of apple pie, pumpkin pie, cherry pie, and stuff like that. But also, if you're a SpongeBob fan, today is the day that Mr. Krabs gets fried from the original SpongeBob movie as well, ladies and gentlemen. So that's also today's date as well. So if you're watching the original SpongeBob movie, that is that date in the film where that happened for Mr. Krabs, the day he almost got fried by King Neptune, ladies and gentlemen. But as we conclude today's program, we want to thank you for all your support of Gridiron Gridlock during the college football season, as well as Hardwood Gameday for college basketball. We couldn't have done it without you guys. I've seen that we hit 101 viewers watching right now. So we truly appreciate all that you all do for ETB, as well as Gridiron Gridlock, as well as our college basketball of Hardwood Gameday as well. So without further ado, we're going to conclude today's program, and we'll catch you all next week here on Hardwood Gameday. So long for now. Bye-bye.